Welcome, everybody, to a special edition of All In with Art Stapleton, a New York Giants podcast brought to you by NorthJersey.com and The Record. I'm your host, Art Stapleton. We are coming to you from the Fieldhouse at 1925 Giants Drive. John Harbaugh's introductory press conference as the 21st head coach in the 101-year history of the New York Giants has just completed. We got a lot to talk about, a lot of impressions here. Harbaugh's first time to be in this building as the head coach, and my one-on-one, I caught up with John Harbaugh, so fired off a couple questions for you, NorthJersey.com and the All In audience. So let's go from the top. We had Joe Shane, general manager, introduce John Harbaugh here, and what I can say is I've been to several of these for the Giants, and that comes from the down decade plus of what they've dealt with. And I've seen the introductory press conference for Ben McAdoo. Fortunately for John Harbaugh, the suit fit. That was inside in the auditorium. Then we had Pat Shurmur inside in the auditorium. We had Joe Judge out at MetLife Stadium, which was right before COVID hit. And then we, of course, had Brian Daboll in the Fieldhouse here. So we're going on coach number 5, 7 total head coaches, including the 2 interims, Steve Spagnuolo and Mike Kafka. And this just feels different. As I've written on NorthJersey.com and in the print editions of the Bergen Record and on All In, as I've said, when John Harbaugh walks in the room, everybody sits up a little bit more, you straighten up, you clear your mind, you clear your head, and you get ready for the head coach that doesn't need to convince you who he is. And you'll hear part of that in my one-on-one with John Harbaugh, comparing when 18 years ago he became the head coach of the Baltimore Ravens. He was an unknown on Andy Reid's staff in Philadelphia. The Eagles' defensive backs coach and special teams coordinator. And all of a sudden, the Baltimore Ravens were going outside the box to hire a guy named John Harbaugh. And we'll get into a whole bunch of stuff. I talked to some players. Tyrone Tracy came back up from Miami. Again, congratulations to Tyrone Tracy. He and his fiance, now Zoe, are engaged. And it just speaks to John Harbaugh and what he represents here. Tracy said he cut short his engagement honeymoon, so to speak, down in Miami. Got on a plane. He said Jameis Winston reached out to some players and said, hey, if you can get here, you should get here. And there was probably a group of around 10 to 15 players that were here. What you need to remember is that the players, they don't know when the press conference is going to be. So there are a lot of players who are away on vacation. I know Jackson Dart over the weekend was in Utah, so it's hard to get back. But for the most part, it was good representation here. Saw some offensive linemen here. I know John Michael Schmitz was here. Saw John Runyon, Marcus Bowe. I think from the most part, the Giants here, when you look at who was in the audience, one of the funny moments, I think, was when John Harbaugh left some of the one-on-ones that he was doing in the Fieldhouse and walking back over to WFAN, and that's where the Evan and Tiki show, Evan Roberts, Tiki Barber, and Sean Marash are doing their show here live today. And Harbaugh just kind of joked around, and he goes, we even got celebrities here. Yes, Kate Mara was also here today, and at some point, we'll see if we can get Kate on All In. You guys deserve an actress on here to talk about growing up Giants. But in all sincerity, it was a full house here. I'd say at least 300 people, maybe more in the back end of the field house here. And we're going to get into all of it. But before we go to there, let's go to my one-on-one with John Harbaugh. And we didn't have much time, but we did whatever we could. And we were all in. Obviously, we're here with the new head coach of the New York Football Giants, John Harbaugh. When did it first sink in for you that you were the new head coach of the New York Giants?
Oh, man, that's a great question, Art. I do. I'd have to say it's still sinking in, honestly. It hasn't, probably fully sink in whenever all this is done And you take the suit coat off and you get back. You sit down at your desk and you put the tape on, or you put the depth chart up there. You start looking at free agents and you get to work. Talking to coaches about coming. I think that's when it really sank in.
So did your film work match up to the film work of your father,
Yeah.
Jack?
Oh yeah, we lined up really well.
When he's telling you about this and you're going through the process or trying to go through the process, do you kind of go back to when you were younger and he's giving you advice about when you were taking the Ravens job?
We've had, I would say so. We've had these conversations every day really about football. I mean, he watches our tape and he studies us, and Jim the same way. So it's just been an ongoing blessing to have him. But I think back to the first day in Baltimore when we got hired. It was that surprise hire. Who is this guy?
Yeah, sure.
Probably would have been cool to mention that. I didn't think about that. But who is this guy? And now it's a little different, which is really, really interesting and neat, and I'm just grateful.
The last thing would be last week when you met with Jackson Dart. It reported it wasn't just a hi and bye. You spent a lot of time with him.
Yeah.
Just curious, what did you take from that meeting? And obviously things still weren't done, but when you walk out of the room with that quarterback, do you have that feeling of, I want to work with this kid?
Absolutely. I felt like that's exactly the feeling I had, just what he's about, and he had a great grasp of the team, the players, what they'd gone through this year, where he would like to see the team go. I mean, kind of a visionary guy, 22 years old, yet he had just sort of a vision for, what he wants to build as a quarterback. It was very impressive.
Looking forward to covering you.
Thanks, Art.
Thanks, John.
Okay,
appreciate it. So there you go, John Harbaugh, the first of many one-on-ones that I plan on having and covering him and his career. The longest tenured head coach that I have covered since Tom Coughlin was Brian Daboll, and he was fired with he went 3 years and there were 7 games left in the season, and Brian Daboll lost his job. So maybe it's me. So hopefully I'm going to sprinkle some salt somewhere along the line and see if I can help change, for you Giants fans, some of the luck and some of the misfortune that's been around here. But I think when you listen to John Harbaugh, you realize this isn't about luck. This is about preparation. This is about belief. I said to Tyrone Tracy the idea of, out of all the coaches that you have, why is this different? And he said, because when you watch someone, and he said that Harbaugh talked in his press conference about turning on the tape. Don't show me a roster, show me the tape. And Tracy said, we always think that as players, that's how you want to be judged. You don't want to be judged about what's on paper. You want to be judged on what's on tape. And he said, for John Harbaugh, that's how his players will judge him. This isn't about sliding a resume across the table when he gets in his first team meeting. This is about, we know John Harbaugh. We know who this guy is. No one is asking, who's this guy? As Harbaugh said, in terms of being hired as the head coach of the New York Giants. And I think that goes a long way in terms of bringing credibility, accountability. There isn't a player that will walk into this building for their first chance to be together when the offseason program starts that wonders who is John Harbaugh. And I think that's part of why he's here. I think, as much as Ben McAdoo and Pat Shurmur and Joe Judge and Brian Daboll came here with different credentials and what they brought to the table, they had to win over their players. You had to win over the locker room. John Harbaugh's already won. He's won 180 games in the regular season. That's more than Tom Coughlin, Bill Parcells, Tony Dungy, Mike Shanahan, Mike Holmgren, Bill Cowher. Think about that. That is the credibility. That is what comes here when you look at John Harbaugh and what he brings to the table for the Giants. So we had Joe Shane, obviously, introducing John Harbaugh today. You saw that. We got to speak to Chris Mara off the podium, and Chris talking about his interactions with John Harbaugh. He had never met him before. Now, John Mara was the one who had a relationship with John Harbaugh because of their time together on the league's competition committee. Now, obviously, John Mara and Steve Tisch were both here today. Neither spoke to the media. Chris represented ownership here. And I don't think there's any issue with that in terms of it's just the way it is. I mean, we all know that John Mara is fighting cancer and he's got a battle. And I've said all along, if anyone, I don't wish that on anyone to go through what John Mara is going through right now. But the fact of the matter is, John Mara was a closer in this situation. From everything I understand from what John Harbaugh said, I know there were some tense moments Friday and Saturday, but that was part of the contract negotiations. The all-in audience, everyone who's read me on NorthJersey.com and in the print editions of the Bergen Record knows. When I got that text message at 2 o'clock in the morning, Wednesday into Thursday, and I was told that John Harbaugh was the head coach, I'll go back to my high school days. It was essentially a verbal commitment. He basically verbally committed. Signing day wasn't until Saturday. They still had an opportunity. Other teams in the league had an opportunity to poach him. There still were opportunities that, hey, look, if the lawyers can't get this to work in the contract situation and what we're going to get as far as power structure, where things were, it was never about Joe Shane. It was never about other people. It was about positions, the positions of power, the structure, who reports to who. And I think that was very important to John Harbaugh. And once you agree to that verbally, it's not as easy as you would think to now have your lawyers and the team's representation basically sending back and forth a legal document of over 45 pages, from what I understand, that every single line has to be approved by both sides. And if a change is made, it's not that it goes back to zero, but it basically now all of a sudden has to get reapproved as things go on. So yes, were there tense moments, as with any negotiations? But make no mistake, John Mara and Steve Tisch were ready, willing and able to do whatever it took to get John Harbaugh here. That speaks volumes about the 5-year, $100 million contract, give or take a dollar here or there. And that's why he's here. And there was no point in this entire process that John Harbaugh thought of himself as the head coach of any other team but the New York Giants. Was it a process before he finally was convinced that this thing was done and that he was the coach? Sure. But that uncertainty comes from both sides not knowing. If you've ever been a part of a negotiation, and I'll be honest with you, I've never been a part of a negotiation for a job that's going to pay me $100 million. But you have to know that your side and their side, until they become our sides and one team, are always going to have contingency plans. There's a reason why Brian Harlan, the representation for John Harbaugh, was keeping an open mind. If teams had called in, he was going to say, look, nothing's done. Nothing's on paper yet. We have not signed. They're not seeking another opportunity. That idea that the Giants were going to lose John Harbaugh, that really wasn't reality. Did on Tuesday, when Mike Tomlin was fired in Pittsburgh, or when they parted ways, did the Giants reach out to Pittsburgh, to Tomlin, and find out what are his plans? Sure. John Harbaugh had not even come to New Jersey yet. Steve Tisch's plane didn't leave Teterboro and go down to Baltimore and bring John Harbaugh here. So they checked. All signs point to Tomlin joining the media if he's going to do anything, and he's not going to be on the sideline for next year. And that's how that panned out. So that's kind of the background. Some things that Harbaugh talked about I think are interesting is that obviously Jackson Dart touched on that on our one-on-one. From the interviews, I think that you'll appreciate is I got to talk to Jack Harbaugh, and that's John and Jim's father. And he talked about, John mentioned in the press conference the idea that Jack Harbaugh went to work. As soon as John Harbaugh was fired in Baltimore, that Jack Harbaugh, his dad, wanted to know who you're looking at. And he knew one of the teams that were involved with the New York Giants. As John Harbaugh said, the New York Football Giants. And Jack Harbaugh is a historian of this game. I mean, you can see it by listening to John and Jim, and everything that they do in football comes with that historical perspective of where they're at. So I talked to Jack, and I said, what was this all about? Breaking down film about the Giants. And Jack said, look, I didn't have access to the Giants film library for this season. He said, so I went with what I know. And where did he go? He went to Jackson Dart's first start against the Chargers, right over here at MetLife Stadium. And just so happened that they were going against another Harbaugh, Jim Harbaugh. And it was the Giants-Chargers game. And Jack told me, look, I knew that if they were going to win that game, the fact that they won that game, I wanted to watch that team again from the other perspective. I wanted to watch that team from the Giants' perspective. What did they do well that day? And he said he watched the offensive line, and he saw the offensive line were well coached. Hat tip Carm Brasillo and James Ferentz. He thought they were physical. He thought they pushed the Chargers all over the field that day. He mentioned Cam Scadaboo, who had 3 touchdown runs that day, and he mentioned Jackson Dart. And he said he only watched it from an offensive perspective. And he said as he was watching the game, he fired off a text to his son John and said, are you watching this Giants team? He said, this team has talent. He said, look no further. This is where you want to be. So it's kind of ironic that for all the hand-wringing last week about whether or not John Harbaugh would be here and was he going to leave, and if Buffalo had opened or Green Bay had opened, what would have happened? The sense I get is that as soon as John Harbaugh left Baltimore, there was one team at the top of his list, and it was the New York Giants. Now, you can believe what you want to believe. This team was 4-13, all the losing they've done. You can talk about the presence of Joe Shane and the uncertainty regarding ownership and John Mara and Steve Tisch. I can tell you that from a Harbaugh perspective, the family wanted John here. And this is exactly where John wanted to be. Now, would it have worked out? There's a lot to take care of, and that's kind of what happened with the process. So let's move on to what John Harbaugh is going to do next. Now, he said, putting together his coaching staff, they've already brought some coaches from Baltimore. He believes that they will join him here. Now, position coaches, you do not have to worry about the Rooney Rule for minority candidates. So until that gets finalized, but Harbaugh said, yes, there will be coaches that follow him from Baltimore. And that's not talking about Todd Monken. That's not talking about anybody else. But little birdie told me, his name's Jack Harbaugh, told me that after he watched that Chargers game, he said he told John, you know what, if you could bring that offensive coach here, that offensive line coach, you might want to think about that. So for everyone who wants Carm Brasillo back, present company included, at least the father of John Harbaugh, the consigliere, so to speak, put in a good word for Carm Brasillo and James Ferentz to come back. Now, James Ferentz could get an offensive line position coach and not be an assistant this year. But we'll see if that actually takes place. On the defensive side of the ball, I've told you that I think Harbaugh wants someone from the back end. Now, we heard that when we talked to Brian Wacker of the Baltimore Sun a couple weeks ago. They had him on All In, and he talked about how, from a coordinator perspective, having a guy up front on defense is not necessarily what John Harbaugh likes. John Harbaugh wants to have someone on the back end that can give an experience of the entire vision of the defense. So that's why Jim Leonard, who's still alive in the playoffs, so he can't be interviewed by the Giants yet for the defensive coordinator's position. One to watch there is Vance Joseph, because if the defensive coordinator in Denver, Vance Joseph, gets the head job in Arizona, then I think you're competing with Denver and Sean Payton for Jim Leonard. And I think the Giants would like Jim Leonard. Denard Wilson, I believe it would be another candidate for the Giants and the defensive coordinator job. You also had the pass game coordinator in Minnesota. He's an opportunity. He's a possibility. He's likely going to be interviewed. He's also interviewed with the Jets and the Cowboys. So we'll see if that ends up happening. And I think at this point for the Giants, they move forward. I talked to Joe Shane. here's one thing. I'm not sure the Giants are going to push to be at the Senior Bowl. I think there is a lot to get done here in this building. I think John Harbaugh wants to be here in East Rutherford. This is the home base now. This is where he wants to be. I think there's a lot to do with this roster. And I don't necessarily know that they need to go to the Senior Bowl. Now, plans could change. I think the Giants will have a bevy of scouts there. But I'm not sure that the leadership at the top of personnel and football in John Harbaugh and Joe Schoen will be in Mobile. We'll see how that happens. That's a change for the Giants, especially over the last several regimes. Mobile has been a big spot. But I think you're also talking about a coach who does not need to go to Mobile to search for coaches to be on his staff. This is a head coach with experience that people have been calling. I'm told that John Harbaugh has been texting with coaches throughout the league over the last couple days. And it's the idea of, what does it take to come with you? We want to come with you at New York. And I think that's a big difference for this team, this franchise. And they deserve it. They deserve it. The history of this franchise deserves it. As John Harbaugh said, this is the New York Football Giants. And they've lost their way, admittedly. There's a reason why ownership had no problem changing a structure that's been in place since George Young got here as general manager in 1979. There's a reason why the 4 Lombardi trophies that are on display in the lobby and on banners here in the field house, there's a reason why that's not necessarily something that people mention about this team. Now, I'll leave you with this. John Harbaugh, when he showed up here with his wife Ingrid yesterday, coming back for the first time since signing his contract, came into the building with Joe Schoen. Now, I know there's been speculation. Why would Joe Schoen still be here if John Harbaugh will never take the job in New York if Joe Schoen is the general manager. Well, John Harbaugh took the job in New York with Joe Schoen as the general manager. Will they work together? Will it work? They're both committed to doing it. But what I thought was great about that video for John Harbaugh and Joe Schoen, and I've said this and I wrote this in a column, the Giants are not chasing ghosts anymore. They're not chasing 86 and 90 and 07 and 11. They're squarely focused on the future and what they can do next. And when John Harbaugh walked in that lobby, he didn't even turn to his left to acknowledge the 4 Lombardi trophies that are sitting in that case, collecting dust, so to speak, considering what's happened over the last decade plus. John Harbaugh wants to restore the pride in the New York Giants, but he doesn't want to do it on the shoulders of 86 and 90 and 07 and 11. He wants to do it on the shoulders of Jackson Dart and Abdul Carter and Brian Burns and Cam Scatterbo and Malik Neighbors, who Harbaugh did say he talked to him on the phone. Neighbors is out rehabbing in California. Said he can't wait to work with Malik Neighbors. Said throughout the process, Malik Neighbors, the draft process, they watched him, but it was almost like, let's watch him as if we're going to have to face him, because they knew there was no way that the Baltimore Ravens would be able to draft Malik Neighbors. These are the foundation pieces here now for the New York Giants. And it's not about what they've done in the past. They've tried that. They've tried to chase the ghosts. Ben McAdoo talked about it often. Pat Shurmur talked about it often. Joe Judge talked about it often. And then Brian Dable did too. It's not about that. The 5th trophy in the case, that'll take care of itself. John Harbaugh needs to basically build this thing from the first step that he takes as the head coach of the Giants. And I think he did that today. There's a lot more to prove, a lot more to do. And as Harbaugh said when he left the field house after meeting with some of our beat writers before this whole thing kind of shut down, got to go to work. Giants fans, All In Nation, you've got a head coach here who has 180 wins, 13 more in the playoffs, a Super Bowl win, and he's here as invigorated as he's ever been. He's walking into a franchise with all the winning that they've done with a clean slate. John Harbaugh has a clean slate. Think about that. John Harbaugh has learned through 18 years so much winning and some losing and some downtime too of where he wants to go. He's now been given the keys to the kingdom. John Harbaugh's here. He's the head coach of the Giants. Let that sink in and get ready for the ride. We appreciate you being all in, and we are all in as well. For Paul Wood, I'm Art Stapleton. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And we'll catch you soon as Harbaugh continues to build his staff and goes into year one of the New York Giants.